Think about this for a second. Right now, there are over 43 million Americans carrying student loan debt. Together, they owe a staggering $1.7 trillion. We have completely normalized a system where we look at an 18-year-old kid, someone who isn't even old enough to buy a beer or rent a car, and we ask them to sign a piece of paper committing to tens of thousands of dollars in non-dischargeable debt. We treat this as a rite of passage, a natural, inevitable step on the road to the middle class. Like it is just the way the world works. But here is the thing that almost nobody realizes. For the vast majority of American history, this system simply did not exist. The federal student loan, the exact financial product that currently defines the modern American college experience, was not even created until 1958. That means your grandparents, and in many cases your parents, lived in a completely different reality. A reality where you went to college, you paid your tuition, and you graduated. No massive debt. No compound interest eating away at your paycheck for decades. No crushing financial anxiety before you even land your first job. So, the obvious question is, if there were no student loans for the first 180 years of American history, how did anyone afford to go to college? Was higher education just a private country club reserved exclusively for the wealthy elite? Or was there a completely different system in place? A system that we have somehow completely forgotten about? The answer is one of the most fascinating and misunderstood chapters in American economic history. It is a story about space races and Cold War panics, about Abraham Lincoln changing the physical map of the country, and about a quiet, invisible shift that transferred billions of dollars of risk from the government directly onto the shoulders of teenagers. Let me take you back to the beginning. To understand how we ended up with a trillion-dollar debt crisis, we first have to look at what college actually was in early America. If you zoom back to the 1700s and 1800s, the concept of going to college to get a good job simply did not exist. Back then, institutions like Harvard and Yale were not stepping stones to the middle class. They were essentially finishing schools for the top 1%. They were designed to train clergymen, politicians, and the sons of wealthy merchants. For the vast majority of ordinary Americans, the farmers, the blacksmiths, the shopkeepers, college was not even a distant dream. You learned a trade, you worked the land, or you joined the family business. You didn't need a 4-year degree to survive. Because of this, the question of how to afford college did not matter to the average person. If you were going, your family already had the money. You paid in cash, up front. There were no financial aid offices, no FAFSA forms, and absolutely no student loans. The entire system was gate-kept by wealth and social status. But as the country grew and the Industrial Revolution changed how people lived, this aristocratic model started to crack. Ordinary people realized that if they wanted real power, they needed access to higher education. They didn't just want a seat at the table, they demanded it. This shift changed everything. And that rising demand set the stage for a bizarre era that sounds completely impossible to us today. Imagine telling an 18-year-old today that college used to be virtually free. They would think you were crazy. But for a long stretch of American history, that was the actual reality. As the demand for education grew beyond the wealthy elite, states began building their own public universities, and they operated on a philosophy that is almost completely dead today. They believed that an educated population was a public good. What does that mean? It meant society as a whole benefited if you were smart, productive, and capable. Therefore, society, through the government, should foot the bill. In the 1800s and early 1900s, many state universities charged absolutely zero tuition. None. You might have to pay a few dollars for room and board, or maybe a tiny administrative fee, but the actual cost of instruction was covered by state taxes. A young person from a working-class family could literally work a part-time summer job, save up a few weeks' wages, and pay for their entire college education out of pocket. No banks. No interest rates. No debt traps. It was a system built on the assumption that the state was investing in its citizens, not profiting off them. But there was a problem. States only had so much money, and the country was expanding westward at a massive speed. They needed a way to fund public colleges on a much, much larger scale. And the solution came from the absolute most unlikely person, during the darkest moment in American history imaginable. In 1862, the United States was tearing itself apart. The Civil War was raging, the Treasury was bleeding money, and the survival of the nation was entirely in doubt. But right in the middle of this absolute chaos, President Abraham Lincoln signed a piece of legislation that completely rewired the American education system. It was called the Moral Land Grant Act. Here is exactly why it was a stroke of absolute genius. The federal government was desperate to educate the working class, the farmers, the mechanics, the industrial workers who were actually building the country. But the government had absolutely no cash. But what they did have, however, was land. An incomprehensible amount of it. So, Lincoln struck a brilliant deal. The federal government handed over millions of acres of public land to the states. The states then sold that land and used the money to build a massive network of brand new public universities. These became known as the land-grant colleges. You know them today as the massive state schools, often with A&M or state in their names. This was a radical, earth-shattering shift in how America viewed higher education. College was no longer a private country club for the wealthy elite. It was now a public utility, funded by public assets, designed to elevate the common man. The philosophy was very clear: if you educate a farmer, you get better crops. If you educate an engineer, you get better bridges. Society reaps the reward, so society pays the bill. Not the struggling student. But even with all these new affordable schools, the percentage of everyday Americans actually going to college remained relatively small. It took another massive, world-altering crisis to finally push higher education into the American mainstream. And when that event happened, it created the modern middle class practically overnight. Fast forward to the end of World War II. The year is 1945, and the United States federal government is staring down the barrel of a massive economic crisis. Nearly 16 million American soldiers are about to come home. The wartime factories are rapidly shutting down. The government is absolutely terrified that dumping this many young men back into the workforce all at once will trigger a second Great Depression. They needed a place to put these guys. They needed to delay their entry into the job market. And their solution became one of the most successful pieces of legislation in human history, the famous GI Bill of 1944. The government made a staggering offer to returning veterans. Go to college, and we will pay for absolutely everything. We are not just talking about cheap tuition. The federal government covered the entire cost of classes, paid for all the textbooks, and even handed the veterans a monthly living stipend to cover their rent and food. Zero debt. Zero student loans. The impact was explosive. By 1947, veterans accounted for nearly half of all college admissions. Millions of men who had grown up in poverty, guys whose parents were ditch diggers and factory workers, were suddenly walking the halls of elite universities. This was the exact moment the American mindset completely shifted. College was no longer just for the rich, and it was no longer just about becoming a better farmer. It was the ultimate, guaranteed ticket to the modern middle class. The GI Bill proved that when the government funded education, the entire national economy boomed. But this golden era of free, government-funded college was about to hit a brick wall. And the thing that finally broke the system did not come from Washington. It literally came from outer space. On October 4, 1957, Americans looked up at the night sky and realized they were losing. The Soviet Union had just successfully launched Sputnik, the very first artificial satellite, into orbit. The metal sphere was no bigger than a beach ball, but the psychological impact was absolutely devastating. Overnight, a wave of pure panic swept across the United States. If the Soviets could put a satellite in space, they could put a nuclear warhead on a missile and drop it on New York. The Cold War had just escalated, and America realized it was severely outmatched. The government realized they desperately needed a massive new army. Not just guys with rifles, but an army of scientists, mathematicians, engineers, and foreign language experts to beat the Soviets. But there was a massive problem. Pushing millions of new students through college for free, like they did with the GI Bill, was becoming incredibly expensive. The federal budget simply could not handle handing out free rides to everyone anymore. They needed a way to flood the universities with fresh talent, but without the government footing the entire bill. They needed to invent a completely new financial mechanism. A way to get the students to essentially pay for their own Cold War training. The solution they came up with seemed harmless at the time. It was pitched as a small patriotic compromise. But it ended up being the exact moment the trap was permanently set, and the modern student debt machine was finally born. In 1958, Congress passed a law that completely changed the trajectory of the American middle class forever. It was called the National Defense Education Act, or NDEA. Notice the name carefully. They did not call it a student loan act or a bank profit bill. They called it national defense. Because of the Sputnik panic, the federal government pitched this new policy as a patriotic duty. For the very first time in American history, the government started handing out direct loans to college students. But there was a catch. This money was strictly reserved for the absolute brightest kids studying science, math, engineering, or foreign languages. The exact skills needed to beat the Soviet Union. The logic was incredibly simple, and it sounded perfectly reasonable. The government argued that since the student is getting a highly valuable degree that will lead to a high-paying job, the student should bear the cost. The government simply fronts the cash, the student gets smart, beats the Soviets, and then pays the money back with a tiny bit of interest. This was the exact moment the massive philosophical shift happened. College officially went from being a public good funded by society to a private investment funded by personal debt. At first, nobody panicked. These 1958 loans were small, strictly capped, and only given to the top-tier students. It was an emergency military measure, not a nationwide financial system. But once Washington politicians and greedy bankers realized how easy it was to hand out debt to teenagers, the entire game changed entirely. The beast had finally been born. And just a few short years later, the government decided to take this tiny restricted loan program and unleash it on the entire country, setting the perfect stage for the greatest financial trap in American history. By 1965, the American government saw something that made their collective eyes light up. The tiny student loan program from 1958 was actually working. Students were graduating, getting good jobs, and paying the money back. So, President Lyndon B. Johnson decided to take this concept and completely supercharge it. He signed the Higher Education Act of 1965. And this is exactly where the story goes from a patriotic Cold War strategy to a massive, billion-dollar financial machine. The 1965 Act took the restricted student loan program and blew the floodgates wide open. It was no longer just for the math geniuses and the rocket scientists. Now, absolutely anybody could get a massive loan for almost any degree. But the government did not want to lend all this money directly out of its own pocket. They needed massive amounts of cash, so they turned to Wall Street and private banks. Now, if you are a bank, lending thousands of dollars to an 18-year-old with zero credit history, zero collateral, and zero income is a terrible idea. It is the riskiest loan you could possibly make. So, the government made the banks an offer they simply could not refuse. They introduced the Guaranteed Student Loan Program. The federal government told the banks, you hand out the money to these kids. If they pay it back, you keep the interest and make a massive profit. If the kid defaults, the government will step in and pay you back every single penny. End quote. It was a completely risk-free money printer for the banks. They literally could not lose. And once banks realized they had a guaranteed, fail-proof way to make money off teenagers, the cash started flowing like a river. But there was one massive, entirely unintended consequence that would alter the American economy forever. Now that the banks were handing out money like candy, the colleges realized something incredible. Before 1965, if a college raised its tuition too high, students would just drop out. The college would lose money. They were forced to keep prices affordable. But with the new Guaranteed Student Loan Program, that natural ceiling completely vanished. If the college raised the tuition by $1,000, the 18-year-old student didn't care. They weren't paying out of pocket. They just went to the bank, signed another piece of paper, and the bank handed over the cash. This phenomenon has a name. In 1987, Secretary of Education William Bennett wrote an article pointing out this exact flaw. It became known as the Bennett hypothesis. The theory is brutally simple. When the government pumps easy, subsidized loan money into the higher education system, colleges respond by jacking up their prices. Why wouldn't they? If you run a business, and you know your customers have access to an unlimited government-backed credit card, you are going to raise your prices to the absolute maximum. Colleges stopped acting like public institutions and started acting like luxury resorts. They built massive rock climbing walls, lazy rivers, and luxury dorms. They hired thousands of highly paid administrators. They did all of this because they knew the loan money would never stop flowing. The trap had officially sprung. A vicious, unstoppable cycle was created. The colleges raised tuition, so the government increased the loan limits. Because the loan limits went up, the colleges raised the tuition even higher. It was a never-ending loop of debt, and the only person getting crushed in the middle was the American teenager. This was not an accident, it was a perfectly engineered disaster. Wall Street was ready to take this to the next level. As the vicious cycle of tuition hikes and endless loans spun out of control, Wall Street saw an absolute goldmine. If government-backed loans were risk-free for local banks, they were a playground for institutional investors. Enter Sallie Mae. Originally created in 1972 as a government entity to service student loans, it eventually became a massive, publicly traded corporation. Sallie Mae and Wall Street bankers realized they could take thousands of individual student loans, bundle them together, and sell them to investors as profitable securities. These were called SLABs, student loan asset-backed securities. It was the exact same financial wizardry that caused the 2008 housing crash, but applied to teenagers. Investors bought these bundles because they were essentially guaranteed by the federal government. But Wall Street bankers wanted even more security. They lobbied Congress extremely hard, and over a series of laws culminating in 2005, they secured the ultimate victory. They made it virtually impossible to discharge student loan debt in bankruptcy. Think about how insane that is. If you run a business into the ground, or rack up massive credit card debt buying luxury clothes, you can declare bankruptcy and get a fresh start. But if you are an 18-year-old who takes out a loan to study teaching or nursing, that debt follows you to the grave. It cannot be erased. Wall Street transformed the American dream of higher education into a highly weaponized, inescapable financial asset. And they permanently shifted every single ounce of the massive risk onto you. What happened with student loans is not an isolated event. It is part of a massive and quiet revolution that has completely reshaped American society over the last 50 years. Economists call it the Great Risk Shift. Think about how things used to be. For most of the 20th century, the massive financial risks of life were shared. If you worked at a company, you got a guaranteed pension. The company took the risk of funding your retirement. If you went to college, the state funded the university. Society took the risk of paying for your education, trusting that your future productivity would make the whole country stronger. But slowly, piece by piece, all of that risk was transferred directly onto your shoulders. Pensions were secretly replaced by modern plans, meaning if the stock market crashes, your retirement vanishes. And public funding for universities was replaced by massive individual student loans. We took a system where the government invested heavily in its youth, and replaced it with a system where Wall Street extracts endless wealth from teenagers. The burden of building a skilled national workforce was entirely outsourced to young kids who have absolutely no prior financial literacy. This was a brilliant, devastating magic trick. The government slashed its education budgets, the universities built massive luxury empires, and the banks printed billions of dollars in risk-free profits. And who was left holding the bag? Millions of ordinary Americans, starting their adult lives deeply in the red. The modern student debt crisis we face today is not a random accident. It is not the result of lazy kids getting worthless degrees. It is the exact mathematical result of a system working exactly as it was designed to work. It was a deliberate, calculated choice to fully monetize the American dream. So, the next time you hear someone complaining about the trillion-dollar student loan crisis, remember this. The system was not broken by accident. It was built this way on purpose. We took one of the greatest engines of human progress, and we turned it into a financial product. We took something that used to be a public good, funded by society to build a stronger nation, and we transformed it into a lifelong personal debt. Just like the quiet shift from company pensions to risky retirement accounts, the student loan system is the ultimate example of the great risk shift. The banks get the guaranteed profits. The universities get the massive tuition checks. And you get the bill. The world before 1958 was not a perfect paradise, but it was a world where an 18-year-old could start their life without signing away their financial future. Whether that world was better or worse depends entirely on what you value. But understanding how it disappeared is absolutely essential to understanding the invisible forces controlling your money today. If this story changed how you see the world, hit that subscribe button. We uncover the hidden machinery behind money and power,